Writing broadcast news is quite a bit different from writing newspaper style or print style news. Here's the final edit of that Bragg 104 fire story that we worked with in earlier videos. Let's recast it as a radio news story. Remember that we had this recording from one of the victims of the fire. Her name was Darla Jansen from Smyrna, Tennessee, and imagine you had recorded audio of her saying this. I was pretty scared. I was sitting down front when it started. By the time I got to the door, I could barely see, and it was getting hard to breathe. People stayed surprisingly calm, though. I fell on the steps and gashed my knee pretty good at one point, but this girl behind me just pulled me up and said, "You're okay, keep going." I'm really glad everyone made it out okay. So again, pretend that you have a recording of her saying this, her own voice, her own words, while she was being treated by that paramedic at the scene. Okay, here's what a radio version of the story would look like with her quote incorporated into the story. Instead of a straight news lead, the broadcast version of the story begins with an introduction. Read on the air and usually live by the anchor, the intro gets listeners' attention and introduces both the story and the reporter who is going to be telling the story. The anchor, of course, does not read the word intro aloud. That's just a label to identify where the introduction begins. Remember, this is a script that is seen only by the anchor. This is not something that the audience sees on a screen somewhere because the audience doesn't see anything. The audience is listening to this on the radio. Different stations use different formats and labels, but this example gives a general idea of what most radio stations do. In this intro, the story summary is just one sentence, but multiple sentences are okay. Throughout the story, keep sentences short and clear. That's important. You're also free to be funny, cheeky, ironic, playful, coy, whatever it takes to get attention, as long, of course, as it's appropriate for the story and doesn't overtly depart from journalistic objectivity. Read your writing out loud to yourself. Make sure there are no tongue twisters or awkward sounding phrases. Also, make sure you can read each sentence in a single breath. Importantly, make sure the intro emphasizes the latest possible aspect of the story. This may well be the first time many listeners are hearing about the fire, but instead of starting with the past tense, "a projector caught fire Thursday" at an MTSU lecture hall, the way a print-style story would, the lead needs to begin with a present tense description of what is happening right now. For example, in this example, it starts with an intro that says workers are cleaning up an MTSU lecture hall after the room's projector caught fire Thursday and sent dozens of students scrambling to the exits. Do you see how that emphasizes what's happening right now? Now, obviously, you would only report this if, in fact, workers are cleaning up an MTSU lecture hall after the room's projector caught fire Thursday. You don't make stuff up just so you can have a current angle on the story, but try to find the latest thing that is happening right now about whatever story you're trying to report. You could even, if you wanted to, spin it forward into the future and focus on what will happen. Something like classes will resume Friday morning after a projector in a lecture hall caught fire and forced dozens of students to scramble to the exits, that sort of thing. You're focusing on the future. That's kind of the ultimate latest stuff, right? It hasn't even happened yet. So this intro is going to end with a toss to the story's reporter, whose name would appear in place of the blank that you see here on the screen. So if I were the reporter on this story, the intro would be read by the anchor. It would say something like, "Workers are cleaning up at MTSU lecture hall after the room's projector caught fire Thursday and sent dozens of students scrambling to the exits. WMOT's Ken Blake has the story." After this toss, the segment switches from the announcer's voice to the reporter's voice. And unlike the announcer's intro, the reporter's story is usually recorded, and the announcer ends this toss by starting the story's recording. So the story label indicates where the reporter's recorded story begins. And of course, like the intro label, the story label is not read out loud to listeners. Listeners will simply hear the reporter begin speaking by saying Smyrna, freshman, Darla, and so on. Anything the reporter might mispronounce or stumble over is spelled out phonetically. Suppose, for example, that Jansen's name, which I've been pronouncing with a hard J, suppose her last name has an unconventional pronunciation, like it starts with a Y sound. It's Jansen instead of Jansen. Well, you'd want to get that right on the air when you read the name out loud. So you would use a phonetic spelling like this to indicate that it's Jantzen with the emphasis on the last syllable and starting with a Y sound instead of a J sound. And room 104, notice the same things happen there. You could read the word 104 in a lot of ways. 104, 104, or 104. If you spell it out phonetically like this, then that's going to standardize how people are going to pronounce the word when the story is being read on the air. You have lots of leeway in deciding how to organize the reporter-narrated portion of this radio script. This example basically tells the story chronologically, which is okay. But trust your instincts here. You're probably pretty good at holding a conversation and you know how to tell stories in ways that keep people's attention. And that's what you're doing here. So lean into those instincts when you're writing your broadcast story. Just be sure your story opener doesn't simply repeat the intro. That's going to bore people. You have to keep the story moving forward. A big difference between print style and broadcast stories, of course, is your audience doesn't see the quotes that are in the story. Your audience is going to hear those quotes. So that's what this roll tape label and end tape label indicate. The roll tape label shows where the sound bite is going to begin, and the end tape label shows where it's going to end. Keep each of these sound bites truly bite-sized. 5 to 10 seconds is best. If it's too long, people are going to get bored or they're going to tune away to something else. Radio news stories also often use environmental sound bites. For example, if you were covering a protest as a radio reporter, you would probably record some background audio of protesters shouting or doing whatever they're doing at the scene of this protest. And then you might play this sound bite at the beginning of your story before you start talking, or you might play this sound bite throughout your story as you were talking as kind of background noise to whatever you're saying. And then radio stories, not always, but often end with a sort of audio byline that identifies the reporter. So if this were my story and I were reading it on the air, I would finish with, "I'm Ken Blake reporting for WMOT News." Here's an example of how all of this works on the air. As you listen to the example, listen for the intro, the part read by the anchor. Listen for the toss where the anchor says, reporter so-and-so has the story, and listen for the sound bite that's positioned within the story. You'll hear the story between the end of a preceding story and the start of a subsequent story.
They say it does not appear to pose a security threat and cannot collect information beyond what could be gathered by a satellite. Forecasters say a blast of Arctic air is sweeping in over parts of the Northeast. Dangerously cold winds are expected to spark wind chills far below zero. Mount Washington in New Hampshire's White Mountains is home to what's considered the worst weather in the world, and this weekend won't be an exception. From member station WBUR, Samantha Kutsia has more.
Temperatures could get as low as 50 degrees below zero on the summit, setting a new record. With wind chill, forecasters say it will feel anywhere between 100 and 110 degrees below zero. Francis Tarazowitz is a meteorologist at the Mount Washington Observatory.
Exposed skin will become frostbitten in less than a minute, and then even on the warmer end of things, say if the winds were closer to 80 miles per hour and the lows only got down to 30 degrees below zero, frostbite would be expected within 5 minutes or so.
The White Mountains are a popular tourist destination, but Tarazowitz says this isn't the weekend to be heading up there. For NPR News, I'm Samantha Kutsia.
President Biden has been traveling up and down the East Coast this week to discuss.
Broadcast copy rules for writing numbers differ from AP-style rules for writing numbers. In broadcast copy, you use words for 1 through 12. So you would spell them out, Onetwelve, and then switch to figures when you get to 13 and stick with figures through the number 999. But when you get above 999, you switch to number word combinations for these larger numbers. And you also round off whenever possible. So you would write things like 1-1000 with 1000 spelled out, 15-100 with 100 spelled out, 18,000, 10 million, and so forth. You do the same thing when you're expressing dollar amounts. Use the form $1 for everything through $12, $1, $2, $3, and so forth, up to $12. And then when you get to $13, then switch to numbers, $1, $3, and continue that pattern for everything up through $999. Then switch to number word combinations for those larger amounts. And again, round off whenever possible. So you'd write $1,000 like that, $1,500, $18,000, $10 million, and so on. The reason for both of these rules is that you just want to make it easy for the person who's reading the script into a microphone live on the air, right? You don't want to have to make them stop and look for the comma and do the ones, tens, hundreds calculation and figure out whether they're looking at 1,000 or 1,000,000 or whatever. Just spell it out like this, and it makes it much easier, much smoother to read on the air. Another important aspect of broadcast writing, use active voice, like all the time. Active voice is going to convey more energy, more interest. It's going to keep your story interesting to the audience and compelling. So avoid passive voice pretty much all the time when you're writing broadcast copy.